The stagecoach that carried Elena Vance into Harlan County arrived 40 minutes late and smelled like wet leather and somebody else's misery. She didn't mind. She'd been sitting in worse. The road into the valley had turned to mud somewhere past the second creek crossing, and the driver, a heavy-set man named Cutter, who hadn't said 10 words the entire journey, had pushed the horses harder than he probably should have. Elena had braced herself against the side panel and watched the landscape change through the cracked window. The flatlands gave way to rolling hills, then to something quieter and older. Juniper trees, red clay ridges, a sky so wide it felt like a different country. She had a carpetbag wedged between her feet. Inside, 2 dresses, a wool shawl that had belonged to her mother, a small jar of dried herbs she carried everywhere out of habit, and a letter. The letter was folded 4 times and already soft at the creases from being handled too much. Mrs. Vance, the position is still available. We require someone capable of managing a kitchen and household for 6 children. Room and board provided. Wages modest but fair. If you are serious, come before the 1st of October. There was no signature beyond W. Barrett, Ash Hollow Ranch. Elena had read the advertisement in the Millfield Gazette 3 weeks ago, sitting at the kitchen table of her late husband's sister, a woman who had been kind enough to let Elena stay, but unkind enough to make sure Elena understood, in 100 small ways, that the arrangement was temporary. She'd answered the advertisement the same afternoon, sent her reply by morning post, packed her bag before she'd even received confirmation. She was serious. That much was not in question. The town of Harlan's Crossing wasn't large. A main street, maybe 8 blocks, with a hardware store, a dry goods shop, 2 saloons, a church, a post office that also served as the telegraph office, and a hotel with a sagging porch. Elena climbed out of the stagecoach and stood in the street while Cutter dropped her bag onto the boardwalk without ceremony. She looked around. The town watched her back. Not everyone, not all at once, but she caught it. A woman sweeping her front step who paused and didn't resume sweeping. 2 men outside the hardware store whose conversation died mid-sentence. A young boy who stared openly until someone, his mother probably, pulled him inside. Elena was accustomed to being looked at. She was 26 years old, thin in the way that came from seasons of not enough. With dark hair she wore pinned back and a face that people described as serious, even when she was trying to look pleasant. She was not beautiful in any way that turned heads on a crowded street, but she had a quality that was harder to name, something steady in her posture, something in the set of her jaw that made people unsure how to read her. She picked up her bag and walked into the hotel. The man behind the counter was in his 60s, with the kind of face that had given up on expressions long ago. He looked at her the way clerks in small towns sometimes looked at strangers, not hostile exactly, but categorizing. "Room for 1 night," Elena said, "and I need directions to Ash Hollow Ranch." His expression shifted, just slightly. "Ash Hollow," he repeated. "That's right." He told her the rate. She paid it. He put the key on the counter. "Ash Hollow's about 9 miles northeast," he said, "past Ridgeback Creek. You'll take the fork left at the cottonwood stand." He paused. "You got someone meeting you?" "No." "You going to work there?" "I am." He looked at her bag, then at her, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Barrett doesn't get many visitors." "I'm not a visitor," Elena said. "I'm the cook." She picked up her key and went upstairs. She ate supper alone in the small dining room off the hotel lobby. Beans, cornbread, something that might have been pork if you were optimistic about it. The food was plain, but she'd eaten plainer. She cleaned her plate and drank 2 cups of coffee and tried not to think too hard about what she was walking into. She'd cooked professionally before. Sort of. She'd kept house for the Waverly family in Millfield for 2 years before she'd married Thomas Vance. And Thomas's mother had taught her to cook in the serious way that produced food in quantity without waste. Because on a farm, that was the whole point. After Thomas died, after the bad harvest, after the debt, after the part of the story she didn't like to revisit, she'd done what work she could find. Washing, mending, some cooking for a boarding house on the east side of town. Enough to survive, not enough to build anything on. This job was something, a real something, Room and board and wages, modest or not. Stability or the possibility of it. Structure. 6 children and a widower on an isolated ranch. She wasn't naive. She knew what people would say. She knew what some people were probably already saying, just from watching her climb off that stagecoach with her one carpet bag and ask directions to a single man's property. Let them say it. She finished her coffee and went to bed and slept better than she had in months. She hired a ride the next morning from a man named Stubbs, who ran a small livery at the edge of town and seemed vaguely annoyed at having to work before 8 o'clock. His wagon was old and his horse was older, and the 9 miles to Ash Hollow took nearly 2 hours over roads that were still soft from 2 days of rain. Stubbs didn't talk much, which suited Elena. She sat beside him and watched the land go by and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she'd developed over the last year and a half. The trick was to keep the mind still without letting it go empty, because empty was where the bad things waited. The valley opened up around her as they climbed. It was beautiful in the specific way of land that doesn't know it's beautiful. Raw and uncurated, the grass brown gold at the tips, the ridges going purple in the morning light. A hawk turned slow circles high overhead. She watched it until it dropped below a hill crest and disappeared. "There's your ranch," Stubbs said. She looked. The first thing she saw was the fence. 3 lines of barbed wire running along the road, some posts leaning, one section that had been repaired with wire of a different gauge, wrapped unevenly. Then the gate, standing open because one hinge had given out and it couldn't close all the way. Then the long drive leading back to the house. The house was 2 stories, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. It had been white once. The paint was peeling now in long curls, and several boards on the porch railing had gone gray and soft. The barn beyond the house was in better shape, newer boards on the south side, a good roof, but one of the outbuildings beyond that had a door hanging open and swinging in the wind with a sound like slow, irregular knocking. Stubbs pulled up at the end of the drive. "I'll leave you here," he said. He said it like he meant more than the walk up the drive, like he was staying clear of the property itself. Elena climbed down with her bag. "Thank you." He turned the horse around without another word and headed back toward town at a pace that seemed, to her, slightly hurried. She stood at the gate and looked at the house. It looked like a place where someone had stopped trying. She squared her shoulders and walked up the drive. Before she reached the porch steps, the front door opened and a girl appeared in it. Maybe 12, maybe 13. Hard to tell with children who had that look of older than they should be. Dark hair, dark eyes, wearing a dress that fit badly across the shoulders and had been let out at the hem more than once. She stood in the doorway and looked at Elena without moving. "You the cook?" the girl said. "I am. Elena Vance." "I know. Pa got your letter." The girl didn't step aside. "I'm Nora. I'm the oldest." "Hello, Nora." A pause. The girl's eyes moved to the carpet bag. "That all you brought?" "That's all I needed." Something in the girl's face shifted, not warming up exactly, more like recalibrating. She stepped back from the door. "You can come in," she said. "Pa's out back, on." The inside of the house was clean, Elena noted. Not tidy. There were boots left in the wrong places and a stack of mending on the parlor table and muddy handprints on the lower part of the kitchen door frame, but clean. Someone was keeping after it. Nora, she suspected. The kitchen was large and practical, which was good. Cast iron stove, solid and well seasoned. A good pie safe. Deep counters. 2 windows that let in decent light. The pantry, when Elena opened it, was another matter. Sparse in a way that suggested they were working with less than they should be. Flour, dried beans, salt pork, a sack of cornmeal going a little stale. 2 jars of put-up tomatoes. Not nothing, but not enough for 6 children either. She stood in the pantry doorway and took inventory without writing anything down. "We manage," Nora said behind her. The girl had followed her through the house silently. "I can see that," Elena said. Not sarcasm. Truth. "The others will be home by noon. They do chores in the morning." Nora was reciting this like it was information Elena needed to file. "Caleb's 8, the twins are 6, that's May and Ruthie, and then there's Holt, who's 10, and Danny, who's 4. Danny doesn't do chores yet on account of he's too little, and he mostly gets in the way. That's 5. What? 5 plus you, that's 6. Nora looked at her with the particular expression of a child who is used to being the smartest person in the room and is uncertain whether that is still the case. Yes. All right, Elena said. She pulled her shawl off and found a hook by the kitchen door and hung it there. Is there coffee? Not. Wade Barrett came through the back door 20 minutes later, and Elena's first impression of him was that he was a large man who had forgotten he was large. He wasn't stooped exactly, but there was something in the way he moved through his own house. Carefully, like he wasn't sure he had the right to take up space. He was maybe 35, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of face that hadn't been properly looked after in some time. Good bones underneath, probably. Broad through the shoulders, calloused hands, the easy movement of a man who spent his life doing physical work. But his eyes were flat in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness. He saw her at the kitchen table and stopped. Mrs. Vance. Mr. Barrett. He took off his hat. He wasn't sure where to put it. He set it on the counter. I didn't expect you until afternoon. The stagecoach was faster than I thought. He nodded like this was significant information. Then he looked around the kitchen like he was trying to figure out how she'd gotten in. Nora was standing in the doorway to the hall, watching both of them with the careful attention of a child who has learned to read rooms. Nora let me in, Elena said. Right. He rubbed the back of his neck. Well, good. You found the place all right. I did. Silence. The pantry's low, Elena said. I'll need to know your account at the dry goods store, or make other arrangements before I can cook properly for this many children. He blinked, like she'd said something unexpected. I can give you a list, he said finally. I usually go into town on Fridays. Friday's 3 days away. What do you have that I can work with tonight? He thought about it, seemed genuinely unsure. Nora, he said. Salt pork and beans, Nora said, and cornmeal. That's supper then, Elena said. She stood up. Could you show me my room? I'd like to put my things away. Bottom. The room was small and cold. The window faced north and the glass was thin, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook on the wall. The mattress dipped in the middle. The quilt on top of it was handmade and had been at some point very beautiful, with a pattern Elena didn't know the name of, all interlocking triangles in blue and brown and something that might have been green before it faded. She set her carpet bag down and sat on the edge of the bed and tested it. She'd slept in worse. She unpacked her 2 dresses and hung them on the hook, set the jar of herbs on the washstand, folded her mother's shawl, and put it in the bag's inside pocket where it would stay until she needed it. She sat there for a moment in the quiet. Through the thin wall, she could hear the house, the settling sounds of old wood, a shutter that wanted tightening, somewhere distant, the wind working its way around the corner of the barn. And underneath that, barely, a child's voice. Too far to make out words, just the shape of it. A question, maybe. She stood up and went back to the kitchen. The children arrived in stages, which was the only way 5 children under 13 ever arrived anywhere. First came Caleb and Holt together, the way boys that age moved in pairs when they didn't know whether to be suspicious or curious. Caleb was the 8-year-old, round-faced, with a gap where his front teeth were growing in, the kind of boy whose feelings crossed his face in real time, whether he wanted them to or not. Holt was 10 and already learning to be careful. He had his father's eyes, the same flat quality, but in his case it read more like watchfulness than absence. They came in the back door, stopped when they saw Elena, and then stood there for a beat longer than was comfortable. I'm Elena, she said. She was cutting salt pork at the counter. I'm the cook. We know, Holt said. Pa said, Caleb added. You hungry? Caleb opened his mouth immediately and said, yes, and Holt elbowed him, and Caleb looked confused about why he'd been elbowed. Supper won't be ready until evening, Elena said, but I found some dried apples in the back of the pantry, if you want some while you wait. She said it casually, not a bribe, not an offering, just information. She kept cutting. There was a silence, and then Caleb drifted toward the table, the way children drift toward things they want while maintaining the appearance of indifference. Holt stayed by the door. Where are they? Caleb said. Elena pointed to the small dish she'd set out on the table. Not many. The bag was nearly empty. But enough. Caleb took a few with careful hands, like he wasn't sure he was supposed to. Take more, Elena said. There aren't enough to save for later. The twins came home 20 minutes after, and Danny was with them, carried on Nora's back because he'd apparently gotten a rock in his boot and decided walking was no longer an option. May and Ruthie were identical in the way that made adults slow down and look twice, with their father's dark hair and their mother's, someone's anyway, small, quick hands. They stood side by side in the kitchen doorway and looked at Elena with the same expression, like they'd practiced it. "Are you nice?" May said. "May," Nora said, warning in her voice. "It's a fair question," Elena said. She turned from the stove. "I'm trying to be. Sometimes I'm more tired than nice, but I'll always be honest, which is better." The twins exchanged a look. It was the kind of look that happened in twin language, fast and entire. "Mrs. Purvis wasn't honest," Ruthie said. "Who's Mrs. Purvis?" "The last cook," Holt said from the corner where he'd ended up somewhere between the door and the table. "She left in September." "Why?" Silence. "She didn't like it here," Nora said, in a tone that closed the subject. Elena turned back to the stove. "The woman before Mrs. Purvis? Was there one?" More silence, a different kind. "Before Mrs. Purvis was Miss Aiken," Nora said finally, "and before her was just Pa." Elena stirred the beans. "Your father cooks?" "He tries," Caleb said, and then his face went through several adjustments as he checked whether he'd said something wrong. "It's not bad. It's just the same." Elena nodded. "Well, I know more than one thing to cook." Wade Barrett came in for supper at 7 o'clock, after the children were already seated. He'd washed up. She could tell by the damp hair pushed back from his forehead, and he sat at the head of the table and looked at the pot Elena set down in the center of it with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Salt pork and beans," she said. She set down the cornbread beside it. "I found molasses in the back of the pantry. There's butter if anyone wants it." The children were already reaching. She stood for a moment uncertain of her place at the table. She'd assumed she would eat in the kitchen, the way cooks did, but Nora was already looking at her and then at the empty chair to the left of her father, and Danny had crawled into the chair beside it and was looking up at Elena with his chin just barely clearing the table. "Sit down, Mrs. Vance," Wade said. He said it roughly, like he'd had to push it out. She sat down. The meal was quiet, not uncomfortable quiet. Well, the children ate the way hungry children eat, which occupied them fully. Caleb got molasses on his sleeve and looked at it with resigned acceptance. Ruthie and May conducted some kind of ongoing negotiation about who had more cornbread that involved a lot of pointed looks and very little talking. Holt ate steadily and didn't look up. Nora served Danny his portion and cut it for him without being asked. Wade ate slowly, like he was doing it out of obligation more than hunger. Partway through the meal, Danny, who had been eating with the focused concentration of a 4-year-old confronting something he wanted to finish before anyone could stop him, looked up at Elena and said, "Is there more?" "There is," Elena said. He held out his bowl. She served him more without comment. He went back to eating, and somewhere across the table in the corner of her eye, she saw Wade Barrett watch this exchange and look back down at his plate, and something in his face shifted in a way she couldn't name. She woke the second morning to the sound of rain on the roof and a child standing in her doorway. Danny. He was still in his sleep clothes, barefoot, holding something against his chest with both hands. He looked at her with the utterly calm expression of small children who have not yet learned that walking into someone's room without knocking is a thing that requires apology. "What are you holding?" Elena said. He held it out. A small wooden horse, brown paint mostly worn off. One leg had been broken and reattached badly, a little crooked. "His leg is crooked," Danny said. "I can see that." "Nora says it's not fixable." Elena sat up. "What do you want me to do about it?" He thought about this with great seriousness. "I don't know. I just wanted to show someone." She looked at the horse. She was not a woodcarver and had no particular skill for fixing things. She did have, in her herb jar, a piece of heavy twine she used sometimes for bundling, and she thought if the leg was wrapped carefully, it might stand more reliably, even if the angle couldn't be corrected. "Bring it to me in the kitchen after breakfast," she said. "I'll see what I can do." He looked at her for a moment, then tucked the horse back against his chest, turned around, and walked down the hall. She could hear his bare feet on the floorboards, slow and deliberate. She lay back for a moment and listened to the rain. She went to town with Wade on Friday. He drove the wagon and she sat beside him with the list she'd made. A real list, categorized, with approximate quantities noted and starred items marked as essential against non-starred items marked as preferred. She'd given it to him the evening before, and he'd looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "This is a lot," he'd said finally. "That's what it takes to feed 8 people. 8." He stopped. Counted, probably. 6 children, himself, her. 8, Elena confirmed. He'd folded the list and put it in his pocket. She hadn't been sure whether that meant yes or no. But here they were, on the road to town, the horses moving at a good pace in the cool morning. The silence between them was manageable. It was the kind of quiet that had stopped being awkward and started being something else. She wasn't sure what, exactly, but not uncomfortable. He drove with the easy confidence of a man who'd made this trip so many times it required no thought, and she looked at the valley around them, the way the light came down through the breaking clouds and lit the ridges gold and red. "The children seem better this week," Wade said. She glanced at him. "Better than what?" she asked. He kept his eyes on the road. "Better than before." She thought about how to respond. Nora was still guarded, but she'd started asking Elena questions about the recipes. Not curious questions, more like assessment, like a deputy checking whether the new sheriff knew the territory. Holt still hung back, but he'd started appearing in the kitchen doorway in the evenings, not asking for anything, just present. The twins had decided, apparently over some internal deliberation she hadn't been present for, that Elena was acceptable, and expressed this by treating her like furniture, talking around her, near her, occasionally at her, in the complete ease way children had with people they trusted enough to stop performing for. And Danny brought her things. The horse was on the kitchen windowsill now, leg rewrapped with twine, not perfect, but standing. He'd also brought her a gray rock he thought was interesting, a piece of bark that he said looked like a face. It did, sort of, and a button he'd found in the yard. "They're good children," Elena said. Wade's jaw moved. "They've had a hard time of it." "I know." He didn't say anything for a moment. A hawk crossed the road ahead of them and rose into the gray sky. "She died 2 years ago," he said. "Their mother, Clara." Elena had known this in the abstract. "Widower," the letter said. But abstract was different from 2 years ago said out loud by the person living it. "I'm sorry," she said. "Fever." He said it quickly, the way you said the thing you'd said 100 times. The short version, the one that let you get past it. 6 days, it was fast. "That's its own particular cruelty," Elena said. He looked at her, direct, for the first time since she'd met him. "Yes," he said. Just that. They drove in silence the rest of the way to town. Dorian Pike owned more of Harlan's Crossing than most people realized. Not legally, not yet, but in the way that mattered in small towns, which was in obligation and debt, and the accumulated weight of favors given that were never quite free. He had interests in the mill, a stake in the hotel she'd stayed in her first night, and some arrangement with the dry goods store that no one discussed directly, but that everyone understood. He was 45, polished in the way of men who'd made money young enough to practice looking like they'd always had it. He wore his clothes well and kept his manners impeccable, and smiled at you in a way that was warm and didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Elena saw him for the first time in the dry goods store. She was working through the list, speaking with the store owner, a small and meticulous man named Gorton who checked everything twice, when the door opened and Pike came in. He wasn't there for supplies. He came in like a man who owns a space and arrives to remind it of that fact. He spoke to Gorton briefly about something, and then his eyes moved around the store and found Elena, and she felt the calculation in it even at 10 feet. "Mrs. Vance," Wade said, from where he was loading a sack near the door. She realized Pike had said something she hadn't caught. She looked at Pike. "I said, you must be new to the valley," Pike said. His voice was smooth and carried well, the kind of voice that filled a room without effort. "I arrived this week," Elena said. "Harlan's Crossing has a way of keeping people." He smiled. "Or driving them out. Depends on the fit." He glanced at Wade briefly, like a man checking a price tag. "You're at Ash Hollow?" "I am," Elena said. She said nothing else. She turned back to Gorton and her list. She could feel Pike standing there for a moment, the pause of a man unused to being turned away from. And then she heard him moving, and a few words exchanged with Wade that she didn't try to hear, and the door opening and closing. Wade appeared at her shoulder. "That's Dorian Pike," he said. "I guessed." He looked at her. "You know him?" "No, but he introduced himself pretty clearly." Wade looked at the door where Pike had exited. His expression had gone somewhere else. "He's been after my North Range for 2 years, keeps sending men to offer. I keep saying no." He paused. "He doesn't take no the way most men take no." Elena made a note on her list and handed it back to Gorton. "Most men like that don't," she said. "What?" They loaded the wagon and headed back, the bed full of supplies that would let her do her job properly for the next 2 weeks. It was more than she'd hoped for. Wade had approved everything without arguing, which she took as either trust or indifference, and she was willing to accept either for now. She was quiet on the drive back, thinking. She was thinking about the way Pike had looked at Wade, not at his face, but at the ranch behind him, the abstract idea of it, like he was already in the process of imagining it differently. She'd known men like that before. Not this specific man, but the type. Men who looked at other people's things the way certain animals looked at territory. Not angry, not desperate, just patient, in the way that was actually more frightening than anger. She was also thinking about the woman in the post office who had helped her mail a letter and then said, carefully, like she was giving a gift she hoped would be accepted, "You seem like a sensible woman, Mrs. Vance. Ash Hollow's had some difficulty lately. I just mention it." Elena had thanked her and wondered what she meant, and decided she'd find out soon enough. The road came over the ridge and the valley opened below them, and Ash Hollow lay in the late afternoon light, looking, from this distance, almost peaceful. She looked at it for a moment. She thought, "This is someone's home." She thought, "It's holding together with not much left to hold." She thought, and this surprised her, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. She thought, "I don't want to watch it fall." 3 weeks in, she found the envelope. It had been slid under the front door, which meant someone had come up the drive in the night or very early morning. She found it when she came down to start the kitchen fire, just lying on the floor inside the door, no name on the outside. She stood there for a moment with it in her hand. Then she brought it into the kitchen, set it on the table, and started the fire. She did not open it. It wasn't addressed to her. She went about her morning, coffee, then biscuits, then starting the oatmeal that Caleb ate every morning without complaint, and Holt ate every morning while pretending to have opinions about it. And when Wade came in from his early checks, she set his coffee in front of him and put the envelope beside it. He looked at it. "Where'd this come from?" "The front door. Someone left it last night, or this morning." He picked it up. He read it without changing expression, which itself told her something, because she'd learned in 3 weeks that Wade Barrett's face was a mostly honest face. It moved when things moved it, and when it didn't move, it was because he was working not to let it. He folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. "Well," he said. "What does it say?" He looked at her. She held his gaze. "It says I should sell," he said, "before something happens to make selling look like the better option." She didn't say anything. Outside, the rooster had started up, and from upstairs she could hear the particular sound of Danny awake. Small feet on floorboards, then a thump, then nothing, then the feet again. "The offer's from Pike," she said. Not a question. No name on it. "The offer's from Pike," she said again. He turned the envelope over in his hands. Then he set it on the table and picked up his coffee. "I'm not selling," he said. "I know." He looked at her. "You sound very sure of that." "You haven't sold in 2 years," she said. "Whatever he's been doing, it hasn't worked. You're still here." She paused. "So am I, for that matter." He looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing the thing she hadn't fully learned to read yet. Some internal recalibration, something moving beneath the surface. Then something almost like a real expression crossed his face. "Go wake those children up," he said. "If Caleb misses breakfast again, I'll never hear the end of it." She went. The thing about rumors in small towns was that they didn't need to be believed to do damage. They just needed to be said. The first one Elena heard directly was from Nora. She came home from school one Thursday looking like she'd been holding herself very carefully for several hours, which was how Elena was learning to read her. the over-controlled stillness of a girl containing something she didn't know what to do with. Elena didn't ask right away. She let Nora sit down, let her take her boots off and set them by the door the way she always did, let her get a glass of water. Then Elena put a plate of sliced bread and the last of the apple butter in front of her and went back to what she was doing. Nora ate one piece of bread slowly. Then she said, "Greta Cole said people in town are talking." "About what?" "About you." Pause. "And Pa." Elena kept her back to the table. She was trimming the last of the late squash, and she kept the knife moving. "What are they saying?" she asked, level, factual. That you being here is improper." Nora said the last word like she'd borrowed it from someone else's sentence. "Because he's a widower, and you're not married, and you live here." Silence. Just the knife. "What do you think?" Elena said. A longer pause. "I think," Nora said carefully, "that you cooked breakfast at 5 in the morning, and you mended Holt's coat without being asked, and you stayed up 2 nights when May was sick, and I don't see how that's improper in any way that matters." Elena turned around. The girl was looking at her directly, the way she rarely did. That measuring older than she should be look that meant she'd worked through something and come out the other side with a conclusion. "You're right," Elena said. "It isn't. But people will keep saying it." "People will keep saying it," Elena agreed, "and we'll keep doing what we're doing. The saying doesn't change the doing." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she took another piece of bread and reached for the apple butter. "I told Greta Cole that she could keep her opinions," she said. "I didn't use exactly those words." "What words did you use?" Nora's expression didn't change. "Less polite ones." Elena turned back to the squash. "Good girl," she said. The fence on the North Range went down for the first time the 3rd week of October. Wade didn't say much about it at breakfast, just announced it to no one in particular in the tone of a man confirming something he'd been half expecting. 3 posts pulled and the wire cut in 2 places. He and Holt spent the morning repairing it. 2 days later, a section of the gate to the cattle pen was found open before dawn. No cattle were lost. The herd had moved toward the south pasture the night before, away from the open gate, but it was close enough. Elena watched Wade come in that evening and sit down at the table and wrap his hands around his coffee cup and look at the table like it owed him an explanation. The children were in the other room. She could hear Caleb and Danny arguing about something with the low-grade persistence of boys who weren't really angry but had nothing better to do. "This is going to keep happening," she said. He looked up. "Until you do something about it," she said, "or until he thinks he's won." "I know that." "What are you going to do?" He set the cup down. His hands were large and scarred from a decade of this land, and they were very still on the table. "I don't know yet," he said. And the honesty of it, the plain, undefended admission, surprised her. She sat down across from him. This was something she hadn't done much, sitting across from him when it wasn't a meal. But she sat down, and she folded her hands on the table, and she said, "Then let's figure it out." He looked at her for a moment, and again, that thing in his face, the movement under the surface. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm afraid of things," she said. "Just not the right things, usually." He almost smiled. It was brief and imperfect and looked like it surprised him. "All right," he said. "Let's figure it out." Outside, the wind was picking up from the northwest. It moved through the cottonwoods along the creek with a sound like distant water and rattled the window in the kitchen and pressed against the boards of the house like it was testing for weakness. The house held. Inside, 2 people sat across a kitchen table and began to plan, while 6 children made noise in the next room, and a fire burned in the stove and the coffee went slowly cold. It wasn't much, but it was something. The plan they made that night wasn't complicated, because complicated plans made by 2 people at a kitchen table after a long day rarely held together. What they agreed on was simpler. Wade would document everything. Every cut fence, every opened gate, every envelope left under the door. Dates, times, what was found, and where. Elena would keep her ears open in town on the days she went in for supplies, because people talked more freely around a woman they'd already decided was unimportant. It wasn't much of a strategy, but it was more than nothing. and nothing was what they'd had before. What Elena didn't tell him that night, what she filed away and said nothing about, was that she already knew more than she'd let on. The woman at the post office, whose name she'd learned was Vera Hutchins, had become something like a cautious ally over 3 weeks of small exchanges. Vera was 50-something, thin-wristed, with the particular alertness of a woman who had spent decades at the center of a town's information flow and understood exactly what that was worth. She didn't gossip, but she observed, and occasionally she chose to share what she'd observed with people she'd decided deserved to know it. Pike's been having meetings, Vera had told her the last Friday, folding Elena's outgoing letter with practiced efficiency. Private ones at the hotel. Men come in from Cutter Springs and stay 2 nights, then leave. I don't know who they are, but they're not here for the scenery. Elena had thanked her and filed it. Men from Cutter Springs. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she suspected she would. Gimab. November came in cold and stayed that way. The kitchen became the warmest room in the house by necessity rather than design, and Elena noticed that the children migrated to it in the evenings the way heat-seeking things did. Not all at once, not obviously, just by degrees, until most nights after supper someone was always still at the kitchen table. Holt doing schoolwork, Nora reading, the twins playing whatever quiet game they'd invented that week, which involved a lot of whispering and occasional bursts of muffled arguing that stopped whenever an adult looked at them. Danny was the easiest. He had decided, somewhere in the second week, that Elena was his, and that was that, with the absolute confidence of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned that attachment requires permission. He appeared at her elbow when she cooked. He sat on the kitchen floor and talked to himself while she worked. He fell asleep in the chair by the stove one evening, and she carried him upstairs. And he was heavier than he looked, and she stood in the doorway of the room he shared with Caleb and felt something turn over in her chest that she hadn't expected. She had not had children. She and Thomas had been married 3 years, and she had wanted them, and it hadn't happened. And then Thomas was gone, and the wanting was still there, but the context for it had disappeared. She had learned to manage it the way you managed most things that couldn't be fixed, by not looking at it directly, by keeping busy, by being practical. Standing in that doorway with Danny's sleeping weight in her arms, she looked at it directly for the first time in a long time. She put him in his bed and went back downstairs and washed the supper dishes with more attention than they required. The second envelope came on a Wednesday. This one wasn't slid under the door. This one was left on the seat of Wade's wagon, which meant someone had come into the yard in broad daylight while Wade was out on the range and Elena was in the house. The thought of it made something cold move through her. Not fear, exactly, but the recognition of what it meant, that they were being watched, that whoever was doing this wanted them to know they were being watched. Wade read it at the table that evening, the children already in bed, Elena across from him with her mending. "Same as before?" she said. "More specific." He set it down. "He's naming a price now." "What price?" He told her. She did the arithmetic in her head against what she understood of the ranch, the acreage, the cattle numbers, the water rights on the creek. "That's low," she said. "By a third, maybe." He turned the paper over, blank on the back. "It's an insult dressed up as an offer." He knows that. He's not making a real offer yet. He's showing you he thinks you're in a bad enough position to take it anyway. Wade looked at her across the table. "Are we, in that position?" She thought about the pantry, which was better now, the mending pile, which she was working through, the children, who were eating properly and sleeping properly, and had stopped having the slightly dazed look of people managing a crisis from the inside. She thought about the fence on the north range and the opened gate and the envelope left on the wagon seat in the middle of the day. "Not yet," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "You have a very particular way of saying things. I say what I think. I noticed that the first day." She went back to her mending. "Was that a complaint?" He was quiet for long enough that she looked up, and his face was doing that thing again, the not-quite smile, the expression that lived right on the edge of something he didn't have a word for. "No," he said. "It wasn't." But she met Frank Alderman at the dry goods store on the second Friday of November. She'd heard the name before, and Vera had mentioned him in passing, and Wade had referred to him once as his nearest neighbor to the east, which isn't saying much, since east is 6 miles. He was a big man, rangy, with a gray beard that needed attending, and the kind of direct, assessing look that cattlemen often had, like they were perpetually calculating whether something was worth what it was costing. He saw her loading the wagon and came over. "You're the Barrett woman," he said. Then he caught himself. "Sorry, the woman working for Barrett." "Elena Vance," she said, and put out her hand. He shook it with mild surprise, like women who shook hands were a category he hadn't sorted yet. "Frank Alderman. My place is east of Ash Hollow." "I know. How are you?" "Had better months." He looked at her boxes for a moment. "You been there long?" "Going on 5 weeks." He nodded slowly. "How's Wade doing?" "Stubborn," she said, which I mean as a compliment. Something in Alderman's face shifted, something that might have been relief or recognition. "Pike been after you folks too?" "We've had some mail," she said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Mail. He sent 3 men to my south pasture last month to do some surveying. Didn't ask permission. When I went out to meet them, they said they were just passing through." He paused. "On my property, with survey equipment." "Did you report it?" "To who?" "Sheriff Demick takes his coffee at the hotel every morning." He said it flatly, not dramatic, just stating a fact about the way things worked. "Pike's got friends in the right places." Elena thought about what Vera had said. Men from Cutter Springs. She filed Alderman into a different column in her head. Not enemy, not yet fully ally, but something in between. A man who was paying attention. A man who was angry in the useful way, which was quietly. "If something happens at Ash Hollow," she said, "would you want to know about it?" He looked at her. The assessment in his eyes sharpened. "What kind of something?" "The kind that's been happening," she said. "Cut fences, opened gates, letters that aren't really offers." She paused. "If it gets worse." "It'll get worse," he said. Not pessimism, just experience talking. "Then you'd want to know." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You're Wade Barrett's cook." "I am." "You talk like more than a cook." She picked up the last box and set it in the wagon bed. "Someone has to." He watched her climb up onto the wagon seat, then he said, "If something happens, send word. I'll come." She looked at him. "Thank you." She drove back to Ash Hollow thinking about what Alderman had said, and what he hadn't said, and what it meant that a neighboring rancher had felt isolated enough in his own trouble that a stranger's offer of communication had produced that particular look on his face, that mix of relief and wariness of someone who'd been a long time without anyone to talk to about the thing that was eating at them. She thought, Pike's been working this valley for a while, and he's been working it by keeping everyone separate. The town started in on her in earnest around the middle of November. It wasn't all of Harlan's Crossing. Most people had neither the inclination nor the time for it. But there was a particular current running through certain circles, the kind of social pressure that flowed through women's groups and church committees, and the conversations that happened on front porches and at the dry goods counter, and that current had decided that Elena Vance was a subject of concern. She heard it different ways. Vera reported it with careful neutrality, like a weather reading. A woman named Mrs. Oglesby stopped her on the main street and asked her, with the elaborate concern of someone who meant the opposite, whether she was finding the situation at Ash Hollow comfortable. Gorton, at the dry goods store, had started being slightly too formal with her, which meant someone had said something to him. What they were saying, as best she could piece together, was this: that a young widow living under a widower's roof, without proper chaperonage and without any formal arrangement that gave her respectability, was a situation that reflected poorly on both parties. That Wade Barrett was either foolish or indecent for permitting it. That Elena was, depending on who was doing the saying, either a scheming woman who'd wormed her way into a vulnerable household, or a pitiable creature without enough self-respect to know how it looked. She found the second version almost funny, in a grim way. She had been a lot of things in her life, and pitiable was not among them. She didn't respond to any of it directly. She was polite at the counter, civil in the street, and she smiled at Mrs. Oglesby in a way that was warm enough to be unobjectionable, but steady enough to communicate that the concern was unnecessary. What she did was go home and tell Nora. Not the details, not the cruelty, but enough. "There are going to be more days like the one with Greta Cole," Elena told her. They were doing dishes together, which had become their evening habit. Nora washed, Elena dried because Nora was faster at washing and Elena could dry while she thought about other things. You may hear more of it. I want you to know that I know about it, and it doesn't change anything. Nora was quiet for a moment, her hands in the soapy water. Does it bother you? Nora said. Not in the way it's meant to, Elena said. It bothers me that people have nothing better to do. It bothers me that someone is probably encouraging it. She dried a cup and set it on the shelf. But I've been talked about before. You survive it. Mama got talked about, Nora said very quietly. Elena looked at her. What for? The girl's jaw moved. When she first came here, she was from Kansas, and Pa was older than her by quite a bit, and she wore her hair different from the other women. People talked. She paused. She used to say it just meant you were doing something worth noticing. Elena was still for a moment. She sounds like she was smart, she said. She was. Nora put another dish in the rinse water. She would have liked you, I think. It was the most Nora had ever said to her at one go, and Elena understood enough to accept it quietly and not make too much of it, the way you didn't move too fast around something that had taken a long time to come close. I would have liked her, Elena said. They finished the dishes without talking. It wasn't the silence of two people with nothing to say. It was something better. The first real act of violence happened on a Tuesday night at the end of November. Not violence against people. Not yet. But it felt like a line being crossed. Elena heard it before she knew what it was. A sound in the early hours, not loud enough to wake the children, but something wrong in the rhythm of the night. She lay in her narrow bed and listened, and then she was on her feet before she'd made a conscious decision, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders and moving to the window. She couldn't see much. The yard was dark, just the thin light from a partial moon, and the outlines of the barn and the outbuildings and the fence line were all shapes in shadow. But she could see movement, two shapes, near the east side of the barn, low and quick and gone. She went down the stairs fast. Wade was already in the kitchen. He'd heard it too, apparently, because he was pulling his coat on and reaching for the rifle that hung on the bracket by the back door. Stay inside, he said. What did you see? Movement near the barn. He was already at the door. Why, Wade. Stay inside, he said again, and went out. She stood at the back door and watched him cross the yard, and she stood there for the 10 minutes it took him to check the barn and the outbuildings and come back, which were a long 10 minutes during which she thought very clearly about what she would do if she heard something that required her to act regardless of what she'd been told. She would go out. He came back through the kitchen door, and he was holding something in his hand. He set it on the table under the lamp. A dead bird. A chicken. One of the 2 laying hens that Caleb had named and treated as personal property. It had been wrung, left on the ground just inside the barn door. Elena looked at it. Wade looked at her. This is a message, he said. I know. They were here, in the yard, close to the house. His voice had gone very flat, which she'd learned meant something was happening underneath it that he was choosing not to let out. Close enough to... He stopped. The children didn't hear anything. This time. She stood there for a moment, thinking. The anger was there. She could feel it, clean and hot. But underneath the anger was something more useful, which was calculation. You need to write all of this down tonight, she said. The time, what you found, where it was. I'll witness it. Sign your name and mine. Elena, if this ends up in front of any kind of authority, you need a record, you need dates, and you need a witness. She pulled the lamp closer. Get paper. He looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the desk in the parlor and came back with paper and a pencil. They sat at the table and she watched him write, and she added the details he missed. The approximate time she'd heard the sound, the direction the shapes had moved, the specific location of the hen. He wrote in a deliberate hand that pressed hard on the paper, and when he was done, she signed her name beneath his. She took the paper and folded it and put it in the back of the pantry, behind the flour jar. Somewhere they wouldn't look, she said when he raised an eyebrow. If they come in the house. He was quiet. The lamp flickered. You think about things like that, he said. I've had a year of thinking about what happens when you don't plan for the worst. He looked at her, the kind of looking that meant he was actually seeing her, not just the surface of her. She'd been looked at plenty in her life, but not often like that. Like she was a person with depth and history that he was starting to want to understand. She stood up before the moment could become something she didn't know what to do with. "Get some sleep," she said. "The children will be up in 3 hours." He didn't move. "You're not sleeping either." "I'll sleep when I stop thinking." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Does that happen often, the stopping?" "Rarely," she said. "But eventually." She went upstairs. She lay in her narrow bed with the quilt pulled to her chin, and the moon gone behind clouds now, and the house quiet around her. She thought about the two shapes in the yard, fast and low and deliberate. She thought about the document folded behind the flower jar. She thought about Frank Alderman's face when she'd offered to send word. She thought about the particular way Wade had said this time, like he was already imagining the version of events that was worse than this one. She thought, "We need more than a record. We need other people." She thought, "I need to talk to Alderman again. And I need to find out who else Pike has been pressing." The cold came through the thin north window and settled around her, and she pulled the quilt tighter and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, she would start making a different kind of list. What she hadn't counted on was Holt. She was up before 5, as usual, and she was at the stove when she realized she wasn't alone in the kitchen. Holt was sitting at the table, in his coat, like he'd been there for a while. She didn't ask how long. She poured him coffee, half a cup, watered down, the way she'd started giving it to him, because he'd started appearing in the mornings, and she figured if he was going to be up this early, he might as well have something hot. He was 10. She was making a judgment call. "You heard something last night," he said. Not a question. She turned back to the stove. "Yes." "What happened?" She thought about whether to tell him. He was 10, but she'd learned by now, not 10 in the way that meant unaware of what was happening around him. He was 10 in the way of a child who had absorbed a great deal and processed it quietly, which was sometimes more dangerous than the kind who reacted loudly. She told him, plainly, what had been found and what they'd done about it. He listened with his hands around the coffee cup. "Is it going to stop?" he said. "I'm working on that." "That's not an answer." "I know," she said. "I don't have a better one yet." He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Pa thinks it will stop if he holds out long enough." "What do you think?" He looked at the table. "I think holding out isn't the same as doing something." She looked at him. This 10-year-old boy in his coat in a cold kitchen before dawn, who had clearly been thinking about this longer and harder than she'd realized. Something about it, the weight of it, the fact that a child was sitting here carrying this, made the anger return, sharper than before. "You're right," she said. "It isn't." He looked up, like he hadn't expected her to agree. "I'm going to do something," she said. "It just takes longer to put together than holding out does." He nodded. Slowly, like he was filing it. "Okay," he said. She put breakfast on. He stayed at the table and didn't say anything else, but the quality of the silence was different from before. Less holding things in, more holding steady. She thought, he needs to see someone figure this out, not just endure it, actually work through it to the other side. She thought, then I'd better actually do it. No. She wrote to Vera Hutchins that same morning. Not through the post. She gave the letter to the feed store delivery boy who passed through Ash Hollow on Thursdays and asked him to drop it at the post office. In it, she asked one question. Who else in the valley had received approaches from Pike in the past 2 years? And was there anyone Vera thought might be willing to talk? Vera's reply came back the following Thursday, folded into a copy of the county paper like it was nothing in particular. There were 4 names. Alderman, who Elena already knew. A widow named Pierce, who had 30 acres on the western ridge and had reportedly been offered half what the land was worth. A man named Cass Hollowell, who ran a small horse operation on the south end of the valley and had apparently told Pike's man to leave his property in language that had been retold around town with some admiration. And a family, the Dunbars, father and 2 grown sons, who worked a cattle operation twice the size of Barrett's, and who had, according to Vera's careful phrasing, suffered certain inconveniences in the past year that were never properly explained. 4 families, plus the Barretts. That was 5. Elena sat with this information for 3 days before she said anything to Wade. She turned it over, considered what she was actually proposing, thought about whether she was overstepping in a way she had no right to overstep. She was the cook. Technically, she was the woman who started the kitchen fire at 5 in the morning and made sure 6 children ate properly and mended the coats and kept the record of events behind the flour jar. She was also, and she knew this, had known it for some time, more than that. Not in any way anyone had named, but in the way that things shifted when she was present, in the way the house ran differently than it had before she arrived, in the way she and Wade had been sitting across that kitchen table for weeks now, working on things together. She thought about Holt saying holding out isn't the same as doing something. She told Wade on a Sunday evening, after the children were in bed. She put Vera's letter on the table and the list of names beside it, and she explained what she was thinking, which was this. Pike's power in the valley came from the fact that everyone was frightened alone. 5 families frightened alone were just 5 families with problems. 5 families who compared notes and stood together were something else. Something that could go to the county seat maybe, or at least create the kind of visible, unified resistance that made the cost of what Pike was doing too high to keep paying. She laid it out clearly and without embellishment. Wade listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he looked at the list of names. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since November." He looked up. "I didn't want to bring it until I had enough to make it worth something," she said. He sat with it. She let him sit. Outside the window, the wind was doing what it always did in December, pressing against the house with the patient, impersonal determination of something that has all night and doesn't need to hurry. The stove popped once and settled. "Hollowell and I had a disagreement 3 years ago," Wade said finally. "Over a water line. Is it resolved?" "Mostly." "Then you can talk to him." "Elena, you can talk to him," she said. "You've both been dealing with the same man. That's more important than a water line." He looked at her, and she waited, and she could see him thinking it through. The pride of it, the difficulty, the practical calculation on the other side of both of those. "Alderman first," he said. "Alderman first," she agreed. He nodded. Slow and deliberate, like a man making a decision he knows he can't take back. "All right," he said. "We do it your way." She gathered the letters from the table and put them in the inside pocket of her skirt. She did not say "I told you so" or "thank you" or anything that would make the moment into something bigger than it needed to be. She just stood up and said she was going to check the stove before bed. She checked the stove. She banked the fire. She stood there in the kitchen for a moment with her hands resting on the warm iron, in the quiet house with its 6 sleeping children and its one man who had just agreed to stop enduring and start doing something, and she felt, not triumph, nothing that clean, but something. The particular feeling of a plan that has been held in reserve long enough finally being put into motion. It was a start. It would have to be enough for now. Wade rode out to Alderman's place on a Monday morning, which meant Elena had the kitchen to herself and 6 children who all seemed to understand in the specific way children understood things they hadn't been directly told, that something important was happening. Nora was quieter than usual at breakfast. Holt kept looking at the door. Even the twins, who could generally be counted on to create their own weather system regardless of the atmospheric conditions around them, ate without their usual negotiating. Danny ate his oatmeal and then climbed into the chair next to Elena's empty seat and sat there doing nothing in particular, which for Danny was remarkable. "Is Pa going to fix it?" Caleb said. He said it to no one specifically, which was how children ask questions they weren't sure they should be asking. "He's talking to Mr. Alderman," Elena said. "Why?" "Because sometimes the best thing you can do with a problem is find out who else has the same one." Caleb thought about this for a moment. Like when May and Ruthie both didn't want to do the mending and they asked together so they only had to do half. Something like that. May looked up with the expression of someone whose legal precedent has just been cited in an unexpected context. Ruthie looked satisfied. Elena sent them all off to school and chores and spent the morning doing what she always did when she was turning something over in her mind, which was cook. She made a proper soup stock from the ham bone she'd been saving, bread that she let rise twice because she had the time, and a dried apple pie that was more for something to do with her hands than because anyone needed it. The kitchen smelled like warmth by mid-morning, and she stood at the counter and thought about Alderman and what he would say, and about the other names on Vera's list, and about what it took to convince men who had been managing alone that there was something better than managing alone. Wade came back at noon, and she could read the ride in his face before he said a word. Not defeat, but the complicated expression of a man who had done something difficult and found it harder than he expected and was not sure yet whether it had worked. She put coffee in front of him and sat down. "He'll come," Wade said. "To a meeting?" "To a meeting. He wants Hollowell there." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "They know each other better than I knew. Apparently Hollowell's been dealing with Pike's men for longer than any of us realized, since early last year." Elena absorbed this. "That's before your fence troubles started." "Yes." "So Pike works the outer edges first, tests who'll bend and who won't, then moves inward." Wade looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I don't know it. I'm guessing." She paused. "But it fits." He was quiet. Then, Alderman said something else. He said Pike bought a parcel from the Greer family last spring. The Greers were east of Alderman. He said they left so fast they didn't finish the season. The Greer name meant nothing to Elena, but the pattern it represented meant something. He's already gotten someone out. Apparently. She thought about this, about what it meant that Pike had already succeeded once, and how that success must have looked to him. Clean, efficient, a family gone and a parcel acquired and the valley barely noticing. Did Alderman know why the Greers left? He said they had a bad spring, cattle losses. He thought at the time it was sickness. Wade's jaw moved. He doesn't think that now. They sat with it for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the bare cottonwoods along the creek, that dry, rattling December sound. The soup was still on the stove, and the kitchen smelled of it, and in any other context it would have been simply a good winter noon. It wasn't that, quite, but the warmth was real even if what they were talking about was cold. "I'm going to write to the Dunbars," Elena said, "and to the widow Pierce. We need to know if they'll come." "You think a widow woman will come to a meeting with cattle ranchers?" "I think a widow woman with 30 acres that someone wants will come to anything that might help her keep it." She looked at him. "I would." He couldn't argue with that. He didn't try. Chum, getting 5 families to agree on a time and a place took nearly 2 weeks, which was 2 weeks of notes passed through Vera and one direct conversation Elena had with Cass Hollowell at the feed store that she hadn't planned but made use of. Hollowell was a rough-edged man in his 50s with a white scar across his chin and the manner of someone who had decided a long time ago that good manners were a limited resource to be deployed selectively. He looked at Elena like he was evaluating a horse he hadn't planned to buy. "You're the Barrett woman," he said. Second person to say that to her. "Elena Vance, you're Hollowell." "That's right." He looked her up and down once, not offensively, more the way he probably looked at any new thing trying to prove its usefulness. "Alderman says you're the one putting this together." "Wade Barrett's putting it together," she said. "I'm helping him think. From what Frank tells me, there's some debate about which one of you is doing more of which." She looked at him steadily. "Does that bother you?" He thought about it with the unselfconscious honesty of a man who didn't perform much. "Not particularly," he said. "I don't care who has the idea. I care whether it works." "That's the right position," she said. "So tell me why it will." "Because Pike is counting on you all being too proud or too separate to compare notes. The moment you do that, he loses the thing that makes him effective, which isn't money or men. It's your isolation." She kept her voice even. "He's already gotten one family out, the Greers. The next one will be easier than the first, because success teaches a man what works." Hollowell was quiet for a moment. "Unless the next one doesn't work," he said. "Unless that." He bought his feed and she bought her flour and they went their separate ways, and she counted that as good enough. He showed up at the meeting. They held it at Ash Hollow, which was both practical and, Elena suspected, somewhat symbolic. This being the property Pike had been pressing hardest, and these people coming to it being a small act of visible solidarity. She made enough food for 15 people because she made food the way she'd been taught, which was to assume more rather than less. And the parlor was crowded in a way the Barrett house probably hadn't been in years. Alderman came with his oldest boy. Hollowell came alone. The Dunbars, father, Everett, and his 2 sons, big quiet men who looked like people you'd want on your side and would not want against you, came in a wagon that took up most of the yard. The widow Pierce, whose name was Margaret, arrived last, in a coat that had been good 10 years ago and was now doing its best, with the careful dignity of a woman who was not going to let anyone see her be anything less than composed about the fact that she'd driven 6 miles alone on a December morning to sit in a room full of strangers and talk about her problems. Elena put her at the table nearest the stove and brought her coffee and said nothing else, which she had found was usually the most useful thing. Wade ran the meeting. He was not a natural speaker in the formal sense. He was too accustomed to long silences, too accustomed to the rhythms of outdoor work where economy of words was practical rather than social. But he was honest, which counted for more in that room than polish would have. He laid out the timeline of what had happened at Ash Hollow. Then he stopped and looked around the table and said simply, "I'd like to hear yours." They went around the table. It took 2 hours. What came out of those 2 hours was worse than Elena had expected, and she suspected from the faces around her, worse than any of them had known before that moment, because they'd each had their own version and had been living inside it. And when you lived inside your own version of a thing, you could convince yourself it was specific to you, your bad luck, your weakness, your particular circumstance. Hearing it laid out in 5 voices saying variations of the same story removed that particular comfort entirely. Cut fences. Intimidation at the property line. Offers made below value, then repeated when refused. Workers threatened or bought off. The Dunbar boys had found survey stakes on their south pasture 2 months ago with no authorization behind them. Margaret Pierce had been visited by a man claiming to represent a county land bureau that, when she'd written to verify it, didn't appear to exist. That last one landed hard in the room. "He invented a government office," Alderman said, and the flatness in his voice was the flatness of a man revising his understanding of who he was dealing with. "He sent a man pretending to be from one," Margaret corrected quietly. "It may be that the office exists and was simply misrepresented. I don't know which is worse." "I do," Hollowell said. They looked at him. "If he made it up whole, it means he thinks none of us will check. If he borrowed a real name and corrupted it, it means he has reach into official channels." He paused. "Second one's worse." The room was quiet. Elena had been sitting near the kitchen doorway where she could monitor the food and the meeting simultaneously. She had not spoken yet, and she didn't speak now. This part needed to be theirs. The recognition, the anger, the recalibration. Her job now was to let it happen and then offer direction when it had. Wade looked at her briefly. She gave him the smallest nod. "So," he said, "we know what he is. What are we going to do about it?" They argued for another hour about that. Hollowell wanted to go directly to the county seat with a formal complaint. Everett Dunbar thought the county was too slow and that more immediate action was needed, by which he meant something that his sons nodded at with expressions Elena didn't entirely like. Alderman was somewhere in between. He wanted legal recourse, but didn't trust that it would come fast enough to matter. Margaret Pierce listened to all of it, and then said, in her careful, composed way, that she had a cousin who was a surveyor and might be able to establish a paper record of exactly where things stood before anything was changed, which was quieter than all the other proposals and possibly more useful than any of them. Elena said, at the moment she judged the argument had produced its useful heat and was starting to circle. All of it. Not one thing. All of it. They looked at her. Margaret's cousin establishes the survey records. Frank takes the documented incidents to the county. Not just yours. All of ours together, under all our signatures. Cass, you've got contacts in Cutter Springs. You said, is there anyone there who can tell us who's actually been coming to those hotel meetings? Hollowell looked at her with the evaluating look he'd given her at the feed store. Maybe. We don't need to know everything about Pike. We need to know enough to make him expensive. She looked around the room. He's been operating on the assumption that if he keeps the cost to each of us high enough, individually, we'll sell or leave. We make the cost to him higher than the land is worth. Visible resistance, documented, multiple signatures on everything, people at the county seat who know our names. That takes time, Everett Dunbar said. He wasn't arguing, he was stating a fact. Yes, Elena said. It does. And in the meantime, he keeps cutting fences. In the meantime, we watch each other's land. If something happens at Ash Hollow, the aldermans know about it by morning. If something happens at Dunbar's, we know. It doesn't stop him, But it means he's not operating in the dark anymore. She paused. Been comfortable with the dark. I'd like to make him less so. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Hollowell made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a concession. You'd have made a decent general, Mrs. Vance. I'm the cook, she said. Right, he said, like they both knew that wasn't all she was. They reached decisions, imperfect ones, provisional ones, the kind made by a group of people who didn't entirely trust each other yet, but were beginning to understand that trust was going to be necessary. Before they left, every family signed the consolidated document Elena had prepared from the records in the pantry, now expanded to include what each family had contributed. It was witnessed by Vera Hutchins, who had come out with aldermen and spent the meeting sitting quietly in the corner with a cup of coffee and the air of a woman who had been waiting for this particular room to happen for some time. When the last wagon had rolled out of the yard and the children had been pried away from the window where they'd been watching the whole thing, Wade stood in the parlor looking at the room that had, an hour ago, held 15 people and was now empty and slightly disarranged. You prepared those documents before the meeting, he said. I wanted them ready. You assumed it would go well enough to need them. I assumed we'd reach some agreement. I didn't know how good. She was collecting cups from the table. It went better than I expected. Hollowell could have been harder. He liked you. He respected what I was saying. That's different, and also better. Wade picked up a chair and put it back where it belonged. Then he stood with his hands on the back of it and looked at the fireplace, which had burned low, just coals now. My father would have said this was women's work, he said. Not with judgment, more like he was setting something down he'd been carrying. What would you say? He looked at her. I'd say it worked. She gathered the last of the cups and took them to the kitchen, and she heard him behind her, finishing the tidying up in the parlor. The particular sound of a man doing something domestic without thinking about it much, which she'd noticed he was starting to do more of, in small ways, without remarking on it. The barn burned on a Wednesday night in the last week of January. She never knew what woke her. Not sound, or not sound she could later identify. Something changed in the quality of the night, some shift in the air, and she was awake and at the window before she'd processed why. The orange glow was the first thing she saw. Low at first, confined to the south wall, and then, in the time it took her to understand what she was looking at, climbing. She was already moving. Down the hall, hitting the door of Wade's room hard with her fist. Fire! The barn! Now! And then down the stairs and grabbing her coat and boots from the kitchen without stopping to do them up properly, out the back door and into the cold night air that hit her face and smelled of smoke, and something underneath the smoke, something sharper that made her stomach drop. Lantern oil. Someone had used lantern oil. The barn was full-on burning now, the south end completely lost. The fire moving fast and ugly in the dry January air. The cattle were making noise. She could hear them beyond the west pasture fence where they'd been moved weeks ago, a precaution after the dead hen. But the horses, Wade's 2 workhorses and the children's pony, were still inside. She heard it then. Over the fire, over the cattle, over Wade shouting something from the yard as he ran from the house. She heard it, a sound like high, frightened crying, coming from the barn. Not the horses. A child. Danny. Later she would understand how it happened. Danny had taken to sleeping with his wooden horse under his pillow, and sometime in the night he dropped it through the bed slats, and rather than wake anyone, with the independent problem-solving logic of a 4-year-old, he'd gotten up to retrieve it. He'd seen the glow from his window. He'd gone to look, because he was 4 and fire was interesting. She didn't know any of this yet. She just heard his voice inside the burning barn, and she went in. The south end was a wall of fire and heat that was physical, a solid force, and the smoke was low and thick and wrong to breathe. She pulled the collar of her coat up over her mouth and went toward where she'd heard the sound, working along the east wall where the fire hadn't yet reached. The horses screamed somewhere ahead of her. The sound of the burning was enormous and personal, like the fire was angry at something specifically. Danny! She kept her voice as steady as she could. Danny! Where are you? A sob. Near the ground. She moved toward it and found him crouched beside an overturned bucket, arms over his head, his small body curled small enough to break her heart, and she grabbed him and pulled him against her chest and turned back toward the door. The roof section above the center beam chose that moment to let go. Not all of it. A section, large enough. It came down with a sound like a cannon and a rush of heat that she felt on the back of her neck, and she moved, and it missed her by what she would later estimate as perhaps 4 feet, though in the moment it felt like inches. She ran the last 10 feet to the door with Danny locked against her chest, and then Wade was there. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of his voice saying her name in a way it had never said it before. And he was taking Danny from her arms, and then they were both out and the roof was continuing to come apart behind them. She stood in the yard with her hands on her knees, coughing. The cold air was a physical relief, pure and brutal. She pulled it in long, raw breaths. Danny was crying somewhere behind her. She could hear it was the crying of a frightened child, not an injured one, which meant something functioning in her was still cataloging. She straightened up. The barn was fully burning now. There was nothing to save of the structure. Wade had gotten the horses out. She didn't know when. Before he came in after her, she would understand later. The pony was loose in the yard, spooked, running the fence line. The 2 workhorses stood near the gate, blowing hard, their breath coming in clouds in the cold air. She looked at the fire. Wade appeared beside her. He had Danny in one arm, and the boy had his face pressed into Wade's neck, still crying, but quieting. Wade's coat was scorched across one shoulder. He looked at the barn the way you looked at a thing that can't be fixed and has to be accepted anyway. He looked at Elena. She was shaking. She hadn't noticed that until now. Her hands, her arms, some deep internal trembling that she recognized as aftermath. Her coat had a burn mark across the left sleeve where something had caught her without her feeling it. The back of her left hand was starting to smart where the heat had been closest. He looked at that hand. Then without a word, he reached out and took it in his free hand, the one not holding Danny, and held it. Not examining it, not checking the damage, just holding it. She didn't pull away. They stood like that in the cold and watched what remained of the barn burn, and around them the ranch made its noises. The horses settling, the cattle distant, the fire consuming itself in stages. And the children were at the house windows. She could see their faces there, pale in the light of the fire. Nora, with her arms around the twins. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then Danny lifted his head from Wade's neck, looked at the barn with the reddened, exhausted eyes of a child who has cried himself dry, and said, in a very small voice, "My horse is in there. The wooden horse. The one with the crooked leg." Elena felt something give way in her chest, not in a bad way, in the way of things that had been held very tight releasing. "We'll make you another one," she said. He looked at her. "With a crooked leg?" "Exactly as crooked," she said. He put his head back down on his father's shoulder. Wade's hand tightened around Elena's for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was real, and she felt it, and she stood there in the cold and the firelight and understood that something had shifted between them in the last 20 minutes in a way that could not be unshifted, and she was not sure what to do with that yet. But she was also too tired and too shaken to run from it, so she simply stood there and let it be. The rain came around 3 in the morning. It came the way January rain came in the valley, without apology, heavy and cold. And it finished what they couldn't, which was put out the last of the fire. By then the structure was gone anyway, just the stone foundation and 2 standing posts and a smell that would linger for days. The children were back in their beds, eventually. Danny had gone to sleep between Nora and May, which was irregular, but no one was prepared to argue about it. Holt had come outside to look at the barn with the face of someone who was keeping himself very carefully from the thing he felt, and Elena had stood beside him for a while without talking, which seemed to be what he needed, and then he'd gone inside. Elena sat in the kitchen with her burned hand in a basin of cool water that she'd changed twice, and was thinking about the smell of lantern oil, and about whether Dorian Pike had lit the fire himself or sent someone, and what the difference was, and whether it mattered. Wade came in from outside, rain wet, and sat across from her. He looked at her hand in the basin. "How bad is it?" "It'll blister. It's not deep." She'd seen worse burns. She'd had worse once, from a cooking accident years ago. "I'll be fine." He had his elbows on the table and he was looking at her with the kind of steadiness that had nowhere left to hide behind it. No flatness, no careful management. Just the face of a man at the end of a long night who had stopped bothering to protect himself from being seen. "You went in," he said. He was in there. You went in before you knew who it was. She thought about this. It was true. She'd gone in on the sound alone before she'd processed anything about who might be there. It didn't occur to me not to, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. I'm starting to think nothing occurs to you that should stop you. That's not true. I'm stopped by plenty of things. Like what? She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them made everything look warmer than it was. Like things I'm not sure of, she said. I'm stopped by those. He looked at her steadily, then he looked at the table. Elena. He said her name like it was something he'd been holding in his mouth for a while and had finally decided to let out. I need you to know what you've done here, what you've done for them. A pause. I don't have the right words for it. You don't need them tonight, she said. He looked up. Tonight we're both tired and scared and your barn is gone, she said. There'll be time for words later, when they come out right. He looked at her for a moment, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she'd ever seen it. Something raw and certain, and entirely without the careful management he usually kept in place. Something that made her want to look away. And she didn't. Okay, he said. She lifted her hand from the basin, dried it carefully on the cloth beside her. Try to sleep, she said. He nodded, but he didn't move right away. He sat there for a moment longer in the lamplight, rain on the roof, the smell of smoke still coming through the walls, and she felt the weight of it. Everything that had happened, everything that had built to this night, everything that was going to have to be dealt with in the morning. The fire was Pike's declaration. She understood that now. He was done with letters and cut fences. The next move was theirs, and it had to be the right one. She was still thinking about that when she finally went upstairs, her burned hand wrapped in clean cloth, the first gray light of morning beginning at the north window. The morning after the fire, Wade Barrett woke up wanting to ride into town and find Dorian Pike and put his hands on him. He didn't, but it was a near thing. He sat at the kitchen table before the children were up, in the gray early light with his coffee going cold in front of him, and he let himself feel the full weight of it. The barn gone, Elena's burned hand, Danny's small face in the firelight, the horses screaming. He sat with all of it and let it move through him like something physical, because he'd learned over 2 years of grief that the things you refused to feel didn't disappear. They just went somewhere else and waited, and they were always meaner when they came back. Then he heard Elena on the stairs. She came into the kitchen moving carefully, favoring the burned hand without seeming to think about it, the way people did when they'd adapted to pain quickly enough that they stopped registering it as adaptation. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. How's the hand? He said. Stiff. It'll loosen. She went to the stove, checked the fire he'd started earlier, and began coffee without being asked. The automatic, practical motion of someone who understood that the day was going to require fuel regardless of what had happened the night before. How are you? He was quiet. Wade. I want to go into town, he said. She turned and looked at him directly. And do what? You know what? She studied him for a moment, then turned back to the stove. I know, and I understand it. She said it without sentiment, not talking him down, not managing him, just acknowledging. If someone set fire to a building with one of my children inside, I'd want the same thing. He was in there because of Pike, yes. That's not something I can document and file at the county seat, Elena. That's something a man answers for directly. I know that too. She poured coffee and set it in front of him and pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. But if you ride into town today and put your hands on Dorian Pike, here is exactly what happens. Pike has friends with the sheriff. You get arrested. You get held long enough for him to make a move on this property while you're sitting in a cell. Your children are here without you, and everything we've spent the last 2 months building, the meeting, the documents, the other families, it all looks like the work of a violent man with a grudge, and Pike gets to be the victim. He looked at his hands, wrapped around the cup. That's a lot of thinking for this early, he said. I've been up since 4. He looked up. I couldn't sleep, she said simply. No performance in it. I've been sitting with the same thing you have, what he did, what it means, what the right next move is. She paused. The right next move is not you in a jail cell. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the light was coming up over the eastern ridge, pale and cold, and the yard was visible now. And the absence where the barn had been was visible too, the dark stone foundation, the two standing posts still smoking faintly in the wet morning air. "Then what is it?" he said. "It's the county seat. Today. Not Friday, not next week. Today." She wrapped both hands around her own cup, the right one and the bandaged left one together. "We take everything, our documents, the other family's signed accounts, and we go to the county recorder's office, and we file a formal complaint. And we ask specifically about the land bureau that was presented to Margaret Pierce. Because if Pike fabricated a government office to intimidate a widow, that is not a land dispute anymore. That is fraud." He looked at her. "Fraud carries different weight than a neighbor quarrel," she said. "It requires a different kind of response." He was still. "You figured all this out at 4 in the morning," he said. "I had a lot of quiet." He almost smiled. Then the almost smile went away because the burned smell was still in the walls and Danny's wooden horse was ash somewhere in the foundation. "He has to answer for this," Wade said. The flatness was back in his voice, the controlled version of something that wasn't controlled at all. "Some way, some real way." "He will," Elena said. "But the way that actually costs him something is the way that's done in front of people. In writing, on record. The other way," she paused. "The other way only costs you." He looked at her across the table and she held it and didn't look away. She'd learned that he needed that. Not softness, not persuasion, just someone willing to be direct with him without either managing him or backing down. He picked up his coffee and drank it. "Get the documents," he said. "What?" They left Nora in charge, which at 13 she accepted with the gravity of someone who understood exactly what it meant and was not going to waste it. Elena gave her instructions for the day, what to feed the children, where the mending was, that the pony was still jumpy and Caleb should not try to ride her, and Nora listened to all of it with her hands clasped in front of her in the way she had when she was absorbing something carefully. "Be careful in town," Nora said. "We will. Pike." She stopped herself, started again. "He went further than I thought he would." "So did I." Nora's jaw moved. "Is Mrs. Pierce going to be all right? And the Dunbars?" "I'm going to send word to everyone on the way into town. Hollowell's Road is on our route." Elena pulled on her good coat, the one without the burn mark, which she'd moved to the mending pile that morning. "This changes things, Nora. Last night changes things. What Pike did is more visible now, which is the one thing he was trying to avoid." Why would he do it then? Elena thought about this. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer, not a simplified one. Because he's impatient. He thought he was further along than he is. When the meeting happened, he probably found out about it somehow. It told him that his strategy wasn't working the way he expected, and he reacted. She paused. Impatient men make mistakes. He made one last night. Nora looked at her steadily. He almost killed Danny. I know. And you. I know that too. The girl's face was working through something. The careful management cracking just slightly at the edges, the way 13-year-old faces did when the weight of the adult world pressed too hard and too fast. Elena did something she hadn't done before. She put her good hand on Nora's shoulder for a moment. Not a long moment, just long enough. We're still here, she said. All of us. Nora pulled herself back together with visible effort and nodded. Elena and Wade left for town. They stopped at Hollowell's Road first, and Hollowell came to the gate when Wade called, and he listened to the account of the fire with his hands in his coat pockets and a stillness that was not calm. It was the opposite of calm, held very deliberately in the body of a man who understood the cost of acting before thinking. You're going to the county seat, he said when Wade was done. Today. I'm coming. Hollowell. I'm coming, he said again, flat and final. Give me 20 minutes to saddle up. He was ready in 15. Elena sent a note with Hollowell's ranch hand to the Dunbars, and another to Alderman, telling them what had happened and where they were going, and asking them to come if they could or to send word to the county seat if they heard anything from their end. The hand took both notes and wrote out fast, and Elena watched him go and thought about what it meant that Hollowell's ranch hand was already in the habit of riding to the Dunbar place with messages, which was something that hadn't been true 6 weeks ago. The three of them rode into Harlan's Crossing, and the town noted them arriving together. She felt it. The same observation she'd felt on her first day stepping off the stagecoach, but different now. Less idle curiosity, more calculation. People in small towns knew when something had shifted, even before they knew what. They did not stop. The county seat was in Morrow's Falls, 14 miles east, and they made it in under 2 hours on roads that had dried somewhat since the rain. The county recorder's office was a stone building on the square, practical and deliberate, the kind of architecture that said it intended to be taken seriously. Wade laid the documents on the counter. Every recorded incident, dated and witnessed with Elena's signature and then later the signatures from the meeting. The barn fire added in Wade's hand that morning, the ink still fresh. The dead hen with the date. The fabricated land bureau presented to Margaret Pierce, cross-referenced with Vera Hutchins' witnessed account of what she'd told Elena. The recorder was a man named Elias Duff, middle-aged, careful, with the manner of someone who had spent a long career keeping his reactions off his face. He read through the documents slowly. He went back to the Pierce section twice. Wade stood at the counter with his hat in his hands and said nothing. Hollowell stood behind him, also silent, which was a courtesy Elena appreciated. She spoke. "The barn fire from last night," she said, pointing to the addition. "There's an accelerant involved. Lantern oil. The smell was clear when I went in." She paused. "That's arson, Mr. Duff. On property where 6 children live. I'd like to know what that requires, in terms of formal documentation." Duff looked at her. "You went into the burning barn?" "There was a child inside." A pause. "Are you the cook at Ash Hollow Ranch?" "I am." He looked at her for a moment in the way people sometimes did, recalibrating the category she'd been placed in. Then he looked back at the documents. "This land bureau," he said, "the one presented to Mrs. Pierce." "Yes? There is a county land survey office. There is not a county land bureau in any official capacity I am aware of." He said it precisely, like a man who chose his words for their legal weight. If someone was presented with false credentials from a fabricated authority, that is a matter that exceeds my office. He paused. "That would need to go to the state level." Elena felt Wade shift beside her. "How do we do that?" she said. Duff looked at the documents again. Then, with the deliberate movement of a careful man making a careful decision, he squared the papers on the counter and said, "I can help you draft a formal submission. It will take time." "How much time?" "Weeks? Possibly months." He met her gaze. "These things are rarely fast." "And in the meantime?" Wade said. Duff was quiet for a moment. "In the meantime, the fact that this office has received a formal complaint on record, with dates, witness signatures, and documented incidents, means that any subsequent action against your property or person carries significantly more weight than it would without this record." He paused. "It means you are not invisible." It wasn't what they'd come for, not exactly. It wasn't fast enough, and it wasn't satisfying, and it didn't put Pike in front of anyone who could make him stop. But Elena looked at Duff and understood that he was giving them the most honest reading of what was possible, and she had learned in the last year and a half that the most honest reading of what was possible was usually more valuable than a promise that felt better in the moment. "Then let's draft it," she said. They were there for 3 hours. On the ride back, Hollowell said something that surprised her. They were on the open road between Morrow's Falls and the valley, the afternoon light coming down at a low angle, and he pulled his horse up alongside hers and rode quietly for a while before he said it. "My wife left 8 years ago," he said. "Not died. Left." He said it without inflection, neither asking for sympathy nor deflecting it. "She said I was too hard to live with." Elena looked at him. "I probably was," he said. "I still probably am." He paused. "What I mean is, I've been running that place alone for 8 years, and I got real used to thinking that the problems I had were mine, and I had to solve them mine. It didn't occur to me to—" He stopped. "It didn't occur to me that other people might be dealing with the same, and that pooling it would be worth more than solving it separate." "It took someone to make the suggestion," Elena said. "Someone made it. I'm saying I'm glad they did." He looked at the road ahead. Whatever happens with Pike. And I don't think Duff's office is the end of it. Not by a long way. I'm glad these families are talking now. That's worth something regardless. He didn't look at her, and she didn't look at him, which made it easier for both of them. Yes, she said. It is. What Hollowell had predicted was right. Duff's office was not the end of it. Pike did not stop. He was more careful after the barn fire. More careful, Elena suspected, because someone had told him that documents had been filed at the county, and that changed the calculation. The kind of open aggression that arson represented became a liability rather than a tool. But careful didn't mean idle. In February, the note left under the door was a different kind of letter. Not an offer this time. It was addressed to Elena directly, which was new, and it said, in the smooth, reasonable language of a man who had spent years learning to threaten without threatening, that it was a shame about the barn, and that isolated situations so often got worse before they got better, and that for a woman in her particular position, the comfort and safety of a proper situation might be worth considering, and that if she found herself interested in a reference for a position elsewhere, he was in a position to be helpful. She read it once, set it on the table, picked it up, and put it in the pantry with the other documents. Wade read it when she showed him. His face went through several things in rapid succession, then settled into the particular flatness she'd learned to recognize as active suppression. He's trying to get you to leave, he said. Yes. He thinks if you leave, he stopped. He thinks if I leave, the families stop talking and the strategy falls apart. She said it plainly. He's probably not entirely wrong about what my leaving would do. The meeting was at this house. The documents were organized here. If I disappear, there's a gap. She paused. What he's wrong about is that I'm leaving. Wade looked at her. She held his gaze. I'm not leaving, she said. I want to be clear about that. Not because of the plan, not because of the strategy. I'm not leaving because this is where I am, and I'm not a person who moves because someone finds my presence inconvenient. He was quiet for a moment. He's watching you, he said. To know to write to you directly, he's had someone watching this house. The thought was not new. She'd suspected it since the dead hen, but hearing it said out loud in daylight made it something different, more concrete. She thought about the wagon in the yard and Danny going to the barn at night and the way the fire had moved fast, too fast to be accidental, too precise in its starting location. I know, she said. That means... He stopped again. She noticed this about him. When he reached the edge of something that frightened him, not for himself but for the people around him, he stopped talking, like the words would make it more real. It means we need to be more careful, she said. The children especially. He nodded. Then he looked at the letter on the table and he said, I want to respond to him. Wade, not in person, in writing. He met her eyes. I want to write back to Pike, through legitimate channels. I want him to know that the letter was received and documented, and that we consider it a further incident of intimidation, and that it has been added to the formal complaint on record at the county recorder's office. She looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled out the chair and sat down. Sit down, she said. I'll help you write it. He sat down. She found paper and pen. Start with the date, she said. Always start with the date. March came in with mud and cold rain and the particular exhaustion of a winter that had been long and hard and not finished yet, and Elena cooked through all of it and kept the house running and watched the children carefully for the signs that children showed when they were carrying too much. The quietness that wasn't peaceful, the clingy behavior that wasn't affection, the dreams that produced sounds from upstairs at 2 a.m. May was having nightmares. Elena discovered this when she came downstairs one night for water and found May sitting at the kitchen table in her nightgown, very upright, staring at nothing. She didn't ask what the dream was about. She made warm milk. The last of it, she'd have to go to the alderman's tomorrow for more, and set it in front of May, and sat across from her in the quiet kitchen. May held the cup with both hands. She was 6, and in the lamplight she looked both much younger than 6, and somehow also very old. Is the man going to come back? May said. Which man? The one who lit the barn. Elena thought about the right answer. Not the easy one, not the one that would send May back to sleep feeling reassured by something that wasn't true. The right one. I don't know, she said. But there are a lot of people watching now. Your pa and Mr. Alderman and the Dunbars. It's not just us. May thought about this with the gravity of a child who is evaluating whether she is being told something real. And you, she said, and me. You went in the fire, May said. I did. To get Danny. Yes. Another pause. May drank some of the warm milk. Ruthie says you're going to stay, she said. She says you're not going to leave like Mrs. Purvis did. Ruthie's right. How does she know? Ask her, Elena said. She seems to have good instincts. The corner of May's mouth moved, not quite a smile, the beginning of one. They sat together until May's eyes started going heavy, and then Elena walked her back upstairs and stood in the doorway until she was settled. Ruthie was asleep, mouth open, one arm thrown out across the space between the two beds, in the unconscious way of a child who sleeps without guards up. Elena stood there for a moment longer than was necessary. She was thinking about what May had asked. Is the man going to come back? And she was thinking about the answer she hadn't said, because a 6-year-old didn't need it, that yes, probably. That Pike wasn't done, that the county complaint and the letter and the network of families watching each other's land was more than they'd had in October, but it wasn't enough yet, that there was something still coming. She could feel it the way you felt weather before it arrived. She was right. The third week of March, Alderman sent word, not through Vera this time, in person, his ranch hand riding hard to the Ash Hollow gate and calling for Wade before the horse had fully stopped. The message was this. He'd had visitors. 2 men, early morning, and they weren't Pike's usual hands. These were men Alderman had seen once before, briefly, coming out of the hotel in Harlan's Crossing after one of Pike's private meetings. Professional men, he said, though he meant it the way people meant it when the profession in question was not something you discussed openly. They had told him that his water rights on the east branch of the creek were in dispute, and that a legal process was already in motion, and that he might want to retain a lawyer. Elena read Alderman's note twice. Then she read it a third time slowly. He's changed tactics, she said. Wade was standing at the kitchen door, the note in his hand, rereading it himself. Legal process. He's moved from intimidation to a formal legal challenge, or at least the appearance of one. She set the note on the table. It means he's been stung by the county complaint. He knows it's on record, so he's trying to create his own paper trail, getting to lawyers and land offices first, so that if this ends up in front of anyone official, he has something to point to. Can he actually dispute Frank's water rights? I don't know. That depends on the original deeds and survey records. She looked at him. Do you have your deeds? All of them? Original records? In the strongbox. Upstairs. Get them. She paused. And write to Alderman. Tell him not to respond to anything until we've seen what we have. Wade went upstairs. She stood in the kitchen and looked out the window at the yard, at the stone foundation where the barn had been, at the 2 new posts they'd set last week in preparation for rebuilding. The Dunbar boys were coming Saturday to help raise the frame. Everett had offered without being asked, had sent word the morning after the fire, and Elena had accepted without ceremony because the offer was made in the spirit of people who were learning to act like neighbors rather than isolated strangers, and that spirit needed to be met cleanly. She heard Wade on the stairs. She thought about what she needed, which was someone who understood land law. Not county clerks. She'd gotten everything she could from Duff for now. Someone with actual legal knowledge who could look at these deeds and at whatever Pike was claiming and tell her whether the challenge was real or manufactured. She had one idea. Margaret Pierce's cousin was a surveyor. Elena had met him once, briefly, at a follow-up gathering in January, a quiet man named Orrin who spoke precisely and looked at the world with the evaluating eyes of someone who was accustomed to measuring things. She'd formed the impression that he knew more than surveying. Land law was adjacent to his work in a way that made it necessary knowledge. She would write to Margaret, today. Wade came back with the strongbox and set it on the table. Tell me what you see, she said, and sat down beside him as he opened it. They went through the papers together. The original purchase deed, the water rights documentation, the survey from 15 years ago when the property lines had last been formally established. She read more carefully than he did and slower, which he accepted without comment, waiting when she held up a hand at a passage she needed to finish. She found it in the water rights documentation. A clause, standard-looking, buried in the middle of the second page, that referenced a concurrent rights provision. It was the kind of language that was clear enough to a lawyer and opaque enough to everyone else. And it was exactly the kind of language someone like Pike would use to manufacture ambiguity where there hadn't been any. "Here," she said, and pointed. Wade read it again. "What does it mean?" "I'm not sure yet, but I think it's where he's going to try to get in." She looked at him. "I need to write to Margaret Pierce's cousin." He nodded. "Do it." She reached for paper, and her left hand, the burned one, still healing, still stiff at the knuckles, caught on the edge of the table, and she winced before she could stop herself. He saw it. "Let me," he said. She looked at him. "I can write the letter," he said. "Tell me what to say." It was a small thing, a practical accommodation for a hand that wasn't fully healed. But she sat back and let him take the pen, and she dictated, and he wrote in his deliberate pressing hand, and they composed the letter together in the same way they'd been making decisions together for months. Her words, his steadiness, both of them at the same table, the lamp between them. Outside, the March wind was working on the new fence posts. Inside, the house was quiet, in the way it was quiet when the children were occupied and nothing was immediately on fire, and the work being done was the slow, necessary kind. Not comfortable, exactly, but real. She watched his hand move across the paper and thought about the months between October and now, the carpetbag she'd arrived with, the pantry that had been nearly empty, Nora in the doorway with her badly fitted dress and her guarded eyes, Danny bringing her rocks and a button and a piece of bark that looked like a face, the fire, the county seat, the documents behind the flower jar. She thought about the particular way Wade had said her name in the doorway of the burning barn, Elena, like it was something he'd been holding and couldn't hold anymore. She thought, we're not done with Pike. Not close to done. She thought, but we're still here. All of us. The pen scratched across the paper. The wind moved around the corner of the house. Somewhere upstairs, Caleb was explaining something loudly to Holt, and Holt was responding with the patient, weary tone of an older brother who had heard this particular explanation before and would hear it again. Wade finished the letter and looked up at her. "Anything else?" he said. "Ask him to come as soon as he can," she said. "Tell him it's urgent." He added it, signed his name, held it out for her. She signed beneath his, her left hand still stiff, the letters slightly uneven. She folded the letter and set it on the table to go out in the morning, and she sat back in her chair and looked at the man across from her who had hired a cook in October and gotten something he hadn't been expecting. And she thought that she understood now, had understood for a while, if she was honest about it, that whatever she'd come to Ash Hollow looking for, what she'd found was not something she'd had a name for before. Not comfort, not exactly safety, something that required her, something that she fit. She looked away before the thought could go any further, and picked up the deeds again, and went back to the water rights documentation and the buried clause. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. Orrin Pierce arrived on a Thursday, which was 4 days after the letter, and faster than Elena had expected, which told her that Margaret had conveyed the urgency clearly and that Orrin was a man who moved when moving was warranted. He was younger than she'd remembered from January, or maybe just less formal without a gathering around him. He came in a good coat with mud on the boots and a leather satchel that looked like it had traveled extensively and not always comfortably. He shook Wade's hand, nodded to Elena, and sat down at the kitchen table and opened the satchel and said, without preamble, "Show me what you have." They showed him everything, the deeds, the water rights documentation, the buried clause, and then the consolidated complaint from the county recorder's office and the letter from Pike's man to Alderman. Orrin read all of it in sequence, slowly, occasionally going back to compare one document against another. He didn't ask questions while he read. Elena appreciated that. She put coffee in front of him and let him work. He was at it for nearly an hour. When he looked up, his expression was careful in the specific way of people who understand that how they deliver information matters as much as the information itself. "The water rights clause," he said. "It's standard language from the 1860s. It was used widely in the early settlement deeds to account for shared water sources before formal survey boundaries were established." He paused. It does create a theoretical concurrent rights provision, which means that under a certain reading, a downstream property holder could claim partial rights to an upstream water source. Pike's property is downstream from Alderman, Elena said. Correct. Orrin looked at the documentation again. However, and this is significant, that clause was superseded by the 1879 County Water Ordinance, which established individual property water rights as exclusive to the surveyed parcel boundary, unless a formal concurrent use agreement was filed before January of 1880. He looked up. Was any such agreement filed? Not on this property, Wade said. I'd know. Then the clause is effectively inoperative. Any lawyer who told Pike otherwise was either incompetent or lying, and I suspect it wasn't incompetence. Orrin closed the documents. He knew it was unenforceable. The purpose was not to win a legal challenge. The purpose was to introduce enough ambiguity to frighten people who didn't have anyone to read the fine print. The kitchen was quiet. Wade looked at the table. Elena looked at Orrin. Could you put that in writing? She said. I already planned to, Orrin said. What followed was not dramatic, which was its own kind of important thing to understand. The turning of a situation like the one that Dorian Pike had constructed over 2 years did not happen in a single confrontation or a single document or a single morning at the county seat. It happened the way most real things happened, in stages, each one less than satisfying on its own, accumulating into something that eventually tipped. Orrin's written analysis of the water rights clause went to the county recorder's office, attached to the existing complaint, and from there, because Duff had quietly flagged the file to someone at the state level who owed him a professional courtesy, it made its way to a state land commissioner's desk in the Capitol. The false land bureau presented to Margaret Pierce was not a fabricated agency, as it turned out, but a real one whose name had been borrowed without authorization by a man Pike employed, which was in some ways worse than fabrication because it meant there was a specific, documented, legally actionable misrepresentation with a name attached to it. The name attached to it was not Pike's. It was a land agent named Rudd who had worked for Pike for 6 years and who, when interviewed by a state investigator in April, demonstrated the particular loyalty of a man realizing he was about to take the full weight of something he hadn't built alone. Rudd talked. Not all of it came out at once. Some of it came out slowly, over weeks, the way these things did. But it came out. Elena heard pieces of it through Vera, who heard pieces from the state investigator's clerk, who had a sister in Harlan's Crossing who was not as careful about what she mentioned over supper as she probably should have been. She shared what she learned with Wade at the kitchen table in the evenings, and they built the picture together, the same way they'd been doing everything, incrementally, imperfectly, at the same table with coffee and lamplight and the sounds of the house around them. Pike himself was not arrested. Elena had expected this. The men who sat at the top of these arrangements rarely were, at least not quickly. What happened to Pike was slower and in some ways more effective. His business relationships in the county began to change. The hotel in Harlan's Crossing, which he'd had a stake in, had investors who grew cautious when state-level scrutiny appeared. The dry goods arrangement, the one no one discussed directly, quietly lapsed. The men who had been coming from Cutter Springs for the private meetings stopped coming. He was not destroyed. He was diminished. His ability to move freely in the valley, to apply pressure without consequence, to use the structures of small-town power the way he'd been using them. That ability contracted, visibly and quickly, the way a fire did when you cut off its air. He left Harlan's Crossing in June, not in disgrace, not in handcuffs. He departed the way men like him usually departed when things turned against them, which was by relocating to somewhere he hadn't yet made enemies and starting again. The hotel was sold. He sent no more letters. Elena watched his buggy pass through town the one time she happened to be there. A Friday, at the dry goods store with Caleb, who was buying a particular type of candy with 2 weeks' worth of hoarded pennies. She saw the buggy without planning to, and she watched it go without feeling what she'd thought she might feel. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter. The particular feeling of a threat that no longer requires constant monitoring going still. Caleb, who had just made his candy transaction with the focused satisfaction of a 9-year-old who has planned ahead, tugged her sleeve and held up a paper bag. I got enough for everyone, he said. Even Danny, even though he never has his own money. That's decent of you, she said. I know, he said, with complete lack of false modesty. She looked at him. This boy who had been subdued and careful when she'd arrived in October and was now simply himself, unguarded and loud and generous in the impulsive way of children who had stopped conserving themselves for hard times. And she thought, this is what it looks like when children feel safe. Not perfect, not without problems, just unlocked. She took his hand and they walked back to the wagon together. Wade raised the new barn in May. The Dunbar boys came, as they'd promised. Alderman came with his oldest son and his second son, whom Elena hadn't met before, a quiet young man with his father's watchful eyes. Hollowell came, which surprised no one who knew him by then. Margaret Pierce sent Orrin, who turned out to be more useful with a hammer than his profession suggested. Even Gorton from the dry goods store came, which Elena read as its own kind of information about how the town's opinion had shifted since winter. She cooked for 23 people. She started 2 days before. Bread, pies, 3 different kinds of soup that she kept warm on a rotation, biscuits that she made in batches of 4 dozen, because she knew from experience that biscuits disappeared faster than anything else in the presence of working men. She conscripted Nora for the bread and Holt for the carrying and the twins for the setting out and collecting of dishes, and Danny sat on the kitchen counter under strict instructions not to touch anything, which he violated twice and was relocated twice, and returned voluntarily a third time because the kitchen was where everything interesting was happening. She didn't watch the barn go up exactly. She was in the kitchen most of the day. But she heard it. The hammering, the calling of instructions and directions, the occasional burst of laughter that meant something had gone sideways in a minor way, the sound of a lot of people working together toward the same physical goal. She heard it all day, and it settled into her the way good sounds did, without her having to think about it. Late afternoon, when the frame was up and the wall sections were being raised, Wade came to the kitchen door. He was sweaty and had sawdust in his hair and a small cut on his forearm from a piece of wood that had caught him at the wrong angle, which he hadn't bothered to do anything about. He looked like a man who had been working hard and was at the point in the working where the thing you're building starts to look like what it's supposed to be. "Come see," he said. She took off her apron and went out. The frame stood against the late afternoon sky, solid, squared, new lumber, pale gold in the light. Not finished, not roofed yet, but standing, unmistakably standing, in the place where the burned foundation was. And the burned foundation was already half invisible beneath the fresh lumber and the activity around it. She stood beside Wade and looked at it. Around them, men were taking a break, some sitting on the ground, some standing, the sounds of the working day settling into the lower register of tired men who had done good work. The children were out of the house now, drawn by the change in sound, and Danny was sitting on Everett Dunbar's shoulders with his hands on the old man's head for balance, looking at the frame from the extra height with enormous satisfaction. "It'll take another 2 days for the roof," Wade said. "Siding after that." "I know. It won't look the same as the old one." "It'll look better," she said. "It's new." He looked at her. "New things are harder to build than old things," she said, "but they hold together better, usually." He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was very specific and golden, the way late spring light was in that valley. And it lit the new lumber and the people around it and the ridge beyond in a way that would have been almost too much in a painting, but was exactly right in real life. Because real life didn't ask permission to be beautiful at inconvenient moments. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. He had been working toward something for months. She had known this. She had not pushed it, because she understood by now that Wade Barrett moved at his own pace with emotional things. Not from reluctance, but from a genuine need to be sure before he said something that couldn't be unsaid. It was not the worst quality in a person. It was, in fact, a quality she respected, even when it was occasionally frustrating. "You brought this back," he said. "Not the barn, not the ranch." He was looking at her, and she knew what he meant. "You were already holding it together," she said. "I was surviving," he said. "There's a difference. You know there's a difference." She did know. She'd spent a year surviving after Thomas died, and it looked nothing like living and felt nothing like it either. "Yes," she said. "I'm not—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not good at saying things the right way." I know that. You say things the true way, she said. That's harder and better. He looked at her with the unguarded look she'd first seen on the night of the fire, and that appeared more often now, like the management of it had become less necessary, like he'd stopped seeing the point. I don't want you to leave, he said. I know there's a proper way to say this, and I'm probably not… Wade. He stopped. I'm not leaving, she said, simply and without performance, the same way she'd said it to May in the kitchen at 2 a.m, because it was the same answer and it was still true. I told you that in February. I told Nora in November. That was about Pike. It was about here, she said. This is where I am. He looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the noise of the day continued. Someone laughing, Danny saying something incomprehensible from Dunbar's shoulders, the sound of hammers resuming as the break ended. Neither of them moved. I'd like to ask you something, he said, when you're ready to hear it. I'm ready now, she said. He almost smiled. The almost smile she'd been watching transform slowly over 7 months into something that reached his eyes. You sure? Ask the question, Wade. He asked it. She said yes. They were married in August, in the yard at Ash Hollow, on a day that was hot and not particularly cooperative in terms of weather, because a wedding with entirely cooperative weather would not have been in keeping with the character of anything else that had happened at that ranch in the preceding year. It rained briefly in the morning, stopped, started again around noon, and then cleared in the early afternoon into the kind of high blue sky that made everything look very clean and very far. The ceremony was short because neither of them was given to long ceremonies, and because Danny was already on the edge of his tolerance for standing still. Vera Hutchins came. Alderman came with his whole family. The Dunbars came, all 3 of them, in their Sunday clothes, which looked like their regular clothes that had been pressed. Hollowell came alone and stood at the edge of the gathering with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who was moved by something and preferred not to be observed in that state, which Elena noticed and said nothing about. Margaret Pierce brought Orrin and a pie that was honestly very good. Nora stood beside Elena and held her small bouquet, wildflowers, because Elena had said she didn't need anything elaborate, and Nora had gone out at dawn and picked what was blooming in the south pasture, which turned out to be exactly right. She held it with both hands, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was containing something too large for her usual management. And Elena looked at her once, and she looked back, and the look held everything that 2 people who have been through a difficult thing together could put into a look. The twins cried, which they had vehemently denied they would do, and showed absolutely no embarrassment about afterward. Caleb, who had been assigned the role of ring bearer and took it with tremendous seriousness, delivered his contribution without incident, and then immediately demanded to know when there would be food. Holt shook Wade's hand afterward, which was a gesture so adult and so deliberate that Wade had to look away for a moment. Danny, who had been promised he could hold the rings, and then told he actually could not hold the rings, and had required significant negotiation about this, fell asleep against Elena's side during the last 5 minutes, and had to be carried to the house by Everett Dunbar, who accepted the task without comment in the way of a man who had spent his life being useful. The summer turned to fall, and the fall turned toward winter, and Ash Hollow moved through both of them with the rhythms it had always had, work and weather, and the particular chaos of a house full of children who were growing faster than clothes could be let out or replaced. Elena cooked and managed and planned and argued with Wade about the cattle prices, and agreed with him about the North Range fence that needed replacing before it became a real problem. And they sat across the kitchen table in the evenings and talked about things practical and impractical and sometimes not much at all. She was not a different person than she had been in October when she'd stepped off the stagecoach with her carpet bag and asked directions to a dead man's house. She had not been transformed or redeemed or made whole by love, the way stories sometimes suggested happened to women who had been through hard things. She was still the person she'd been, stubborn, practical, slow to trust, and deliberate about it, prone to thinking at 4 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, still carrying Thomas's absence the way you carried any significant loss, not as a wound anymore, but as a weight that had become familiar, that she'd learned to move with rather than around. What was different was simpler than transformation. She was somewhere she fit. She was doing work that mattered in the specific way it mattered when the people it fed and supported were people you loved. She had a kitchen that was hers and a house that was hers, and 6 children who had gradually and unevenly and imperfectly let her into the space that had been their mother's, not replacing Clara. She was careful about that, careful to the point of actively discussing it with Wade when she felt she needed calibration, but occupying something adjacent that was its own shape. Wade was not a man without difficulty. He had moods that went dark in winter, which she now understood and worked with rather than around. He was still slower with words than she sometimes needed him to be, and she was sometimes sharper than the situation warranted, and they argued with the specific unpleasantness of 2 people who knew each other well enough to aim accurately. These arguments never resolved cleanly. They resolved the way real arguments did, imperfectly and sometimes slowly, with one of them eventually conceding something they'd been holding and the other meeting that concession with something equivalent. It was not easy. It was real, which was better. But what she hadn't anticipated was what happened with the valley itself. The families that had gathered in the Ash Hollow parlor on a December afternoon, scared, isolated, unwilling to admit to each other the extent of what they were each dealing with, those families did not go back to being isolated after Pike left. The habit of communication, once established, proved more durable than she'd expected. Alderman's oldest son and the Dunbar's younger son started running cattle to market together in the spring, which cut their costs and was observed by other ranchers in the county and gradually copied. A water-sharing arrangement for the dry season was formalized among 4 properties on the valley's east side, using Oren's survey expertise and a straightforward document that took 3 drafts to get right. Hollowell, who had run his operation for 8 years in deliberate isolation, started showing up at Ash Hollow for supper on Sunday evenings with a bottle of something and the slightly stiff manner of a man who is practicing socializing because he understands it is good for him even if it does not come naturally. Margaret Pierce sold her 30 acres the following year, not to anyone like Pike, but to Alderman's oldest boy, who paid a fair price and let her stay in the house until she was ready to go to her sister's place in the east, which she had been putting off for 3 years. She came to say goodbye on a Tuesday morning, and Elena made coffee, and they sat in the kitchen together for an hour. And Margaret, who was careful and composed and always had been, said only as she was leaving, "I'm glad you weren't the kind to leave." "I told people I wasn't," Elena said. "People say things," Margaret said. "You meant it." She drove away, and Elena watched her go, and the valley settled into its ordinary Tuesday sounds. Years later, enough years that the new barn had weathered and the children had grown past the stages she'd known them in. The Barrett children would tell the story differently depending on who was telling it. Nora's version was precise and chronological because Nora had grown into a woman who organized things carefully and remembered details. She told it to her own children eventually, and her version included the date Elena had arrived and the inventory of the pantry and what Pike's letters had said and the night of the fire and the meeting in December. It was a complete and accurate account. When she got to the part about Elena going into the burning barn, she always paused, which was the only place the precision broke. Caleb's version was shorter and involved more editorial commentary about various people's choices, offered from the perspective of a man who felt strongly about most things. He remembered the dried apples on the first day, which Elena found both touching and slightly absurd. He said once to his younger sister on the occasion of some family difficulty, "When something's hard, you just stay and deal with it. That's what Elena did. That's all you have to do." It was an oversimplification. Elena would have said so herself. But it was the heart of something real, which was what good oversimplifications usually were. Holt, who grew up to be the quietest of them, and the one who understood the most, told it only once to his wife, on their first winter in a house that was proving difficult in ways they hadn't expected. He told it at the kitchen table, which was where the Barretts had always done their most important talking. He said, "She came with nothing, and she didn't try to make it look like something. She just worked, and the working was enough." He paused. The working was everything, actually. May and Ruthie told it together, which was the only way they told most things, and their version was the most emotional and also the least reliable in its details. And it was the version that made people cry, which they had both decided was the appropriate response and would not apologize for. Danny's version was the shortest. He had been 4 when Elena arrived and 5 when she and his father married, and most of what he knew about the hard years came from his siblings rather than his own memory. What he did remember, with the particular clarity of very early memory that survived into adulthood, was warmth. and being carried, and a woman's voice that was steady when everything else wasn't, and a wooden horse on a kitchen windowsill. And being told, in the middle of a burning barn, that there was more, that there was always more when you needed it. He grew up to be a man who cooked for people when they were in trouble, which was his own way of carrying something forward. Elena Barrett, she took the name without hesitation and without sentiment because it was practical and also because she wanted to. Spent the rest of her long life at Ash Hollow doing the work that needed doing, which was always more and different than what she'd expected when she arrived. She was not remembered by the Valley as a hero, which would have struck her as both excessive and slightly irritating. She was remembered as someone who had been there, which was the thing she had chosen and the thing that had mattered. She made mistakes, some of them significant. She was too hard on Holt in one period of his adolescence, and it took time and a real conversation to repair. She held on to a disagreement with Wade past the point of sense one winter, and the household paid for it in a week of strained silences that benefited no one. She misjudged Hollowell once, assumed he was withdrawing when he was actually dealing with something private, and her response to that misjudgment required a genuine apology that cost her. She gave the apology. She moved on. That was the thing about real life. It kept going, and the question was always whether you kept going with it or got stuck in the place where it had hurt you. She had learned this before she ever came to Ash Hollow. She had learned it in the year after Thomas died, in the boarding house on the east side of Millfield, washing other people's laundry and cooking other people's food, and living in the specific suspended quality of someone who has lost the context for their own life and is waiting to find out what comes next. What came next had been a small advertisement in a county gazette and a letter she wrote in the same afternoon and a carpet bag she packed before she had a reply. That was all. That was the whole beginning of it. One decision made without certainty, without guarantee, without anything except the recognition that staying still was its own kind of slow destruction, and that moving, even toward something unknown, even toward a dead man's house with a grieving family and a bare pantry and a valley full of trouble, was better than the alternative. She thought about this sometimes, in the kitchen in the early morning before anyone else was awake, when the fire was new and the coffee was ready and the house was still around her, breathing in the way houses did when the people inside them were sleeping. She thought about the woman she'd been on that stagecoach, thin and serious and hollowed out from too much loss and not enough of anything else, holding a letter folded 4 times. She had not come to Ash Hollow to save anyone. That was the version people told later, the story that made it into the telling. The woman who arrived and stood between a family and destruction. But the truth was smaller and more honest than that. She had come because she needed work. She had stayed because the work mattered, and then because the people mattered, in that order, which was usually how it went. The saving, if that was what it was, had not been separate from the cooking and the mending and the documents behind the flour jar and the meetings at the kitchen table and the burned hand and the letters to Orrin and the 2 hours spent with Danny in a cold kitchen talking about nightmares. It had been those things, all of it, together, ordinary and hard and completely without grandeur in the doing of it. That was what she believed. That was the thing she would have said if anyone had asked her directly what it meant, what she had done, what any of it was worth. She would have said, I stayed, I worked, I didn't leave when it was hard, that's all it was. And then she would have turned back to the stove because there were people to feed and the morning was moving and there was always, always something that needed doing next. The new barn cast its shadow across the yard in the morning light, solid and weathered and exactly the right kind of imperfect. The children's children played in that shadow on summer days and didn't know what had stood there before it, didn't know what it had cost, didn't need to. That was what things built on real foundations did. They held, and the people inside them lived, and the story of how it had been done receded into the ordinary background of a life that was on balance, good. Not because nothing bad had happened, because they had stayed anyway.